Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Jacob Bennett with Bulldog Analytics, and today we're going to be discussing some of the data modeling basics that you can find in Power BI Desktop. Now, in this video, we're going to be walking primarily through the interface in the Power BI Desktop application, as well as some high-level definitions related to data modeling. If you came here to learn advanced data modeling, then unfortunately this video is not for you. However, we do have another video around all things star schema data models in Power BI, cardinality, cross-filter direction, etc. So definitely check that out if you want to get deeper into this topic. Now, as mentioned, this video is going to be primarily an interface discussion around the data model features in Power BI Desktop, supplemented by some high-level definitions to help explain what's going on. So let's go ahead and look at my screen and dive into today's discussion. All right, so as you can see on my screen here, I've got a PBIX data model I've started to develop. As you can see at the top, it's called Dunder Mifflin Sales Dataset. On the far right, you see my data pane where I've got a number of data tables listed out. Data sourcing is the first step in building a data model. So obviously you're going to need to query or pull in data into your PBIX file. Now let's take a step back and just think very simply about building a report, sourcing data. How should that look? I would assume everyone watching this video has Excel experience at the least, where you've got a data tab and then you've got your report tab. You have a data tab and you have your pivot tab. So in that approach, it's a single flat file approach where you just have one data source, one query, and that sources all your reporting. That's perfectly fine, and especially when you're working with small data sources, there's nothing wrong with that single query approach, especially if it's just a single report or an ad hoc report where you don't have to worry about building out a data model with multiple tables and relationships. Now, in this presentation, there will be some application to single table reports or single table data models, but the majority of the discussion will apply to things like a star schema model, which, as mentioned, I have another video diving into that topic. All right, let's talk data sourcing real quick. I've also got another video around Power Query and how to leverage it to source and transform your data. But just very quickly to recap some of the data sourcing techniques, there's this data section on the header of your home tab that has multiple good usable options for sourcing data. The best practice that I always push is going to Power Query by selecting Transform Data, and then you've got those same options here, whether it be through New Source, Recent Sources, Enter Data, etc. All right, for this example, and again, it's called the Dunder Mifflin Sales Dataset. It's simply just some text files on my local desktop that I'm pulling in as the sources for my queries. And I'll have to link to the guy who put all this together, but it gives us a comprehensive look as far as having fact tables and dimension tables to build a data model and give us what appears to be real-world insight into Dunder Mifflin sales. From a Power BI service perspective, you need to consider how you source files like that. Oftentimes, we always encourage people to use a shared location like SharePoint or OneDrive, just because you can manage the credentials and not have to set up a local gateway in order to make sure people have access to the underlying source. But that's for another video, another time. Now that I've sourced all the data that I need for my data model, let's navigate to the data model view. Now over here on the far left side, we've got our report view, we've got our table view, and then next we've got our model view. So let's go ahead and click on that. And what you're going to see here is a default structure that has been kind of auto-applied based on the key recognition or the field recognition, and it's made these auto relationships based on what it thinks it should do. Now, I want to go ahead and say that this is a helpful feature, and it usually will help get me started, but 99.9% of the time, it's not going to be completely correct. And in fact, some of the relationships are going to cause issues if I were to leave them in the model. All right, guys, I took a second off screen there, and I rearranged our data models so that the tables adhere more to a star schema or hub and spoke data model. As you can see, orders is the fact table or hub in the middle, and the other tables on the perimeter act more as dimensional descriptive tables that help explain our analysis. In order to establish a relationship, the way I like to go about it is by finding the keys that I want to relate to one another. So for example, here I've got my customer ID. I want to relate that to customer ID. And if this relationship didn't exist, then all I need to do is simply drag one on top of the other, and it'll automatically establish that relationship, as you can see. Now, the properties pane pops up, and if there's any changes that I need to make around which table it connected to or the cardinality, etc., I can make those here. When talking about active and inactive relationships, this is going to be primarily applicable to when an analyst is leveraging the use relationship function from DAX. Basically, if you have one dim table that you want to relate to multiple keys in your fact table, then you would use this function and setting based on how your report is built and which data you want to visualize. I'll have to create a whole separate video for the DAX use relationship function as it can get quite complex. All right, moving down, let's talk about cross-filter direction at a very high level. So this setting basically determines how filters will get applied in your analysis considering the relationships that have been established in our data model. So for example, if we look at this customer table in relation to this order table, we see that it has a single direction filter coming from the customer table to the order table. So intuitively, this makes me believe that applying a filter from the customer table will limit the orders table, but because it's only a single direction, applying a filter from the orders table will not limit any output from the customers table. So let's go ahead and prove that real quick in the canvas. All right, so to display this, I'm going to go ahead and bring in order number from the order table. And just for sake of illustration today, I'm going to apply a count aggregation on this. Then from the customer table, I'm going to create a slicer. How about instead of customer ID, we use customer name? So the information in this slicer is coming from that customer table, and so based on the relationship we saw, the idea is that if we apply a filter from that customer table, it will affect and essentially limit the data that outputs from the order table. And when I make selections, you can see that that actually is true. Now again, because it's a single direction, if we were to swap these, the idea is that any field from the order table used as a filter would have no bearing or effect on any output from the company table. So let's see that in play really quick. Here I'm going to switch the count of order number to the count of company ID from the company table, the customers table. And then for our slicer, I'm going to switch this over to a field from the orders table. Let's go ahead and use state. All right, now you can see that the expected behavior as we discussed is here at play. The order table, when filtering on the customer ID, has no bearings on the output based on that single directional cross-filtering option. Now, if we were to come back in model view and we were to switch this cross-filter direction to both and click apply changes, now when we come back to the report view, you'll see that this actually does have an impact on the customer table. Note that the both option here seems like it should just be turned on at all times, right? Well, that's not actually true. At the end of the day, there are significant performance drawbacks when using the both options, so we need to try and limit its use when at all possible. All right, coming back to model view to round out a couple aspects of this discussion. If I were to just click in the blank space, that actually brings up the properties pane for the whole model view. And all these options are around how the model view appears to us. So at the top, you can see show the database in the header when applicable. This isn't applicable in this certain instance as I'm not even connected to a database, but if I were, it would list that database under the table name here in the model view for all the tables. Right below that, you can see show related fields when card is collapsed. So if I click that on, nothing has changed initially, but if I click the collapse button at the bottom of each table, you can see that it just displays that key or whatever is related to the relationships that exist in the rest of the model. So I can see that being useful. I want to go ahead and expand or re-expand all of those and turn that back off. Now down at the bottom, it says pin related fields to the top of the card. So similar to what we just saw, it actually just takes those keys or fields that have relationships established on them in the model and it moves them to the top. So that could be helpful depending on what you want to do and how you want to use this model view. Next, moving to the table properties, I'm going to go ahead and click on the orders table, and you can see here that we can define the name. If we wanted to change it, we could type it in here. A description is always nice. As an example, if we wanted to say all sales history for Dunder Mifflin, then it's available there for when you're in model view, but also when you're in the data tab and hovering over orders, you can see it here in a description as well. Now, if you're building out a semantic model, then that goes for any end users that connect to the table. And so it's very powerful when you're providing definitions to not only tables, but also fields. Most of these other features are related to the Q&A preview feature, and so I don't really want to get into that now, but I want to mention two more things. The first being this is hidden option. If I flip this on, you'll see that it actually just makes my table hidden. Now this is a bad example because this is acting as my fact table in the star schema, and so this would essentially break our model. But if it were one of the dimension tables, then it just wouldn't show up as an available feature when I'm building out my report. As you can see over here in the data tab, it also lists it as hidden. You can also just hover over it and wait for that little eye to appear, and you can turn it off and on that way as well. Lastly, this advanced drop down here is where you can define storage mode. I've got another video that gets into the different storage mode types, including live connection, direct query, import, and mixed. Now if I break out any of my tables here and click on a specific field, you'll see that properties for that specific field pop up. Again, we've got the name option, description, some Q&A features. We can hide it or make it appear. We also have some ability to apply formatting to it right here in the model view, which is pretty cool. Something that I see a lot when working with shared semantic models is sometimes people might have a customer ID or some other key or ID, and on that ID or key they'll have a summarize by option applied on sum, for example. Now oftentimes this defaults if your field is like a whole number or a decimal number when it really should just be acting as an ID or a key. So it's something to keep an eye out for, because when we pull that customer ID in for an analysis, it's not going to list them down, but instead it's going to automatically sum them up, and that's not how we want to treat that field. Now along the lines of this, I don't want to get into it too much, but there's a preview feature called Model Explorer and Calculation Group Authoring. And it actually is what has made this model option at the top of my data tab appear here. So if I click on that and I scroll up and I click on Semantic Model, you'll actually see this option to discourage implicit measures. And so if I click that on, that's actually going to turn off that summarize by option for every single field in my data model. And so if I come back over here and I try to bring in that customer ID, and I've got some filters applied here. Let's turn those or delete those real quick. But if I come in here and I try to apply an aggregation, it's not actually possible anymore. Now the only downside here is for fields that I do want to apply an aggregation to, such as sales quantity or total sales dollars. When I drag those in, I'm no longer able to apply that automatic aggregation. As you can see, it's grayed out. The idea here is that it's the preference to write a measure rather than use these auto aggregations, but that's honestly getting into a whole nother topic that we can cover at a different time. All right, back to the model view. This is the last topic I want to cover. This video is getting a little long, but definitely wanted to touch on this topic, and that's around the additional layouts. So down here at the bottom, just like if you were in your Canvas report view and had additional pages you could create, you can actually create these different new layouts. So if I click that, it'll just create layout 1, layout 2, layout 3, etc. And what I can do is I can click auto layout, and what this basically does is it establishes a data model. Actually, in this instance, it just takes into account anything that you've built in the All Tables tab, and it sticks it here. Now the whole idea behind these layout options is that it gives you the ability to view only elements of your data model. So you can limit it down to just a couple of tables and be able to look at and interact with and edit the relationships just from that perspective. And then when you edit or interact with it or change it, it writes it back to the All Tables tab, which is the tab that controls your whole report. For example, if I click over to layout 2 and I drag in orders and customers, it just automatically applies the relationship that exists over in the first tab. So as you can see, we had already created that both cross-filter direction relationship on customer ID to talk about cross-filter direction earlier. Now what's cool is if I come over to layout 2 and I delete this relationship, because this is just a subset of what's displayed in the all tables, it also works the other way around. So anything I control in those more pinpointed views within these layout tabs actually controls the All Tables tab and vice versa. So I can reestablish that relationship right here between the customer IDs. Now it's a single direction cross filter, and I go back to layout 2, and now you can see it's that single direction cross filter. When you've got a ton of tables and the model gets extremely complicated, I can see how this layout option allows you to manage it in a more pinpointed manner. Or maybe you have a star schema data model, but there's multiple fact tables that you want to be able to manage independently. This is just an option that still ties back to that first All Tables tab, but allows you to view the relationships in a different, more limited capacity. All right, guys, that's all I've got today for this video around the basics of data modeling in Power BI, specifically focused on the model view that we looked at today. If you learned something new, I hope that you share it with some colleagues, coworkers, friends. We've got a lot more content in the works, and I hope you're able to look forward to that and learn something from it as well. And we will see you in the next video. Bye.